Section 1 of Weird Tales Double Feature, The Death Pit and In Kashla's Garden by Oscar Schisgall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. The Death Pit, a novelette of grim tragedy. Chapter 1, Out of the Storm. A splotch of yellow light fell from the oil lamp to the flushed face of the boy. He writhed on the creaking bed and moaned while his features were distorted by the agony of fever. His eyes were fiercely closed. One shivering hand grasped the edge of the covers, and from his blistered lips came the harsh query, "Where's Pop? Where is he?" The sallow woman sitting at the bedside glanced around nervously. She hesitated, then her bony hand reached toward the boy's forehead and touched it with a soothing caress. She bent forward until her haggard face hung under the sickly light, until her thin, straggling hair dully reflected the yellow glow. Anguish lurked in her weary eyes as she gazed upon the boy, and she shook her head pityingly. "Where's Pop?" he repeated, raising his voice. His eyes opened, and he stared at her as though he dared the woman to answer. Desperately she tried to smile, but there was no mirth on the bony countenance. "He'll be home soon, Gil. He'll come, soon." "Where is he? I want him." "In a few minutes." "I want him. Call him, Ma. Why don't you call him?" Her tightly pressed lips forced back a sob, but she could not conceal the convulsive heave of her shoulders. Impulsively she rose, a tall, gaunt woman, as stiff and straight as a poplar. She turned away from the bed and moved off through the shadowy darkness of the room. Her clothes, heavy and voluminous, hung about her with ungainly looseness. Her hair was neglected, so that some of it strayed over her listless face. She brushed it away and went to the window. Rain pattered against the pane. Through the blackness outside, a steady wind sent its weird ululations. The woman shuddered. Somewhere in that miserable night was her husband. She did not know where. Peering through the streaming window, she could discern a lonely light far down the road, but that was all, no sign of her husband. It was almost midnight. He should have been home hours ago, but, well, it wouldn't help to worry about Timothy Cruz. Most probably he was in the village, as usual, wasting his time with the shiftless crowd at the store. A sneer twisted the woman's mouth as she walked back to the bed. She looked about the room, a pauper's room, furnished with a few broken chairs, a table which groaned with every weight placed upon it, an old-fashioned closet which might have retained a semblance of dignity, had it been standing on 4 legs instead of 3. And now, to make the poverty of the home even more keenly felt, 2 beds had been brought into the chamber. Those beds had been on the upper floor through the summer, but now with cold weather imminent, they had been carried down. It was foolish, Timothy explained, to heat 2 floors when the family could sleep downstairs. He had said foolish. What he actually meant was impossible. The Cruzes could not afford enough fuel for a whole house. A peculiar little laugh escaped the woman as she viewed the dismal chamber, large and square. The glow of the lamp near her son's bed served but to accentuate the bleakness of the other corners. Again she sat by the boy and stroked his forehead. She watched him writhe for a few moments, then said, "You ought to have a doctor, Gil. Soon as Pop comes home, we'll send for—" "Where's Pop?" The boy caught her hand in a frenzied, trembling grip. Deliriously he repeated, "Where's Pop? Where is he? I want him." "I don't know where he is, son. I never know. Call him. Oh, Mom, please call him." The plaintive wail in his voice tortured her. She looked away, only to be mocked by the persistent splash of rain on the window. If only Timothy would come, it would be so much easier to sit with the fevered boy. But another hour dragged by before Timothy Cruz came home. She did not hear him as he approached the house. The wind drowned the sound of his steps, slewing through the mud. Her long bony fingers were lengthening the flickering wick of the lamp when she felt a gust of wind on her back. She looked around. Leaning against the closed door, her husband stood panting. Water dripped from his uncouth clothes, from his face, from his hands. He drew the soaked cap from his head and tossed it to a chair. And then she saw that he was smiling, a strange, malicious smile, a smile of triumph, almost a leer. His huge head was lowered as he began to pull off the baggy coat. In the dim luminosity of the oil lamp he appeared menacing. About him hovered an air that seemed unreal, fiendish. "How's the kid?" he asked gruffly. "Very bad, Tim. Worse than he was this morning. Fever's awful. Where have you been?" He ignored the question. Instead, he strode lumberingly across the room until he stood beside the bed. From his arms, powerful and dangling, water dripped to the covers. He studied his son's fiery face. "Looks bad," he grunted. "He was delirious before." "Delirious?" He squinted at his wife with suspicion, as if he doubted her report. "From what?" "I don't know, Tim," she answered wearily. "He just sort of raved about everything." He emitted a short guttural sound intended to express displeasure and concern. "His face is all red," he mumbled. "Bad fever, I guess." "Yes, bad fever. I want you to call Dr. Philemon." With a sudden start, Timothy Cruz turned savagely toward his wife. Even the shadows of the room could not hide the wild flames which had leapt to his narrow, swollen eyes. His chest heaved as he lowered his head close to her straggling hair. "Forget Philemon," he commanded, his voice strangely subdued. In surprise, she looked up. Crazy shadows played across her features as she demanded, "What do you mean, forget him? We need him. The boy needs him. I want you to go down to Drake's place where you can telephone." "No, we ain't going to get the doctor." "Ain't gonna get him?" Exasperation sprang into her tones, and she scowled. "You're talking like a fool, Tim. We've got to get him. Just look at Gil. Who knows what's wrong with the boy?" Tim raised his huge shoulders in a stubborn shrug. "I ain't going to call Philemon tonight. Nothing doing." Indignant and angered, the woman jumped up, faced him. She shook a finger under his nose and declared, "Look here, Tim Cruz. I stand a lot from you, but I ain't going to let the boy suffer on account of your thick-headedness. If you don't go out and get the doctor, I'll do it myself." A queer smile appeared on his heavy lips, the same malicious smile he had displayed when he entered the house. "None of us is going to call the doctor tonight. He's too excited to come out here in this weather." "Why?" She shot the word at him as a challenge. Cause I just came from the doctor's house." She frowned questioningly. "You just came from the doctor's?" "Yes." "What for? What were you doing there?" He laughed, harshly, curtly. His hand fell into his pocket, and from it he drew with great deliberation a glittering brooch and a studded wristwatch. From another pocket he extracted a thin packet of bills, $10 bills, and as he held them under the radiance of the oil lamp, he continued to laugh softly. "Look at 'em," he said, exulting. "Look at 'em, Agatha. Worth a couple $100, sure." The woman's eyes were round as she gaped upon the jewels. Her bony hand rose to suppress a gasp. Never before had she gazed upon such glittering, such alluring wealth. A brooch, a wristwatch, and money. Where'd you get that, Tim?" she whispered in awe. "I just told you, didn't I, that I came from the doctor's?" "The doctor's?" She glanced up in terror to encounter his triumphant leer. For an instant they stared into each other's eyes. Then she asked hushedly, "You mean you stole him?" "Just what I did, from that toy safe in his office." "Oh, Tim." Agatha Cruz shrank from her husband. Her ungainly form receded to a corner, and out of its darkness she directed a piercing, incredulous gaze at him. He stood tall and swaggering, a brute of a man, self-satisfaction beaming on his puffed features. "What's the matter?" he asked tauntingly. "How could you do a thing like that, Tim? Steal!" "How?" Contemptuously, he flung the jewels and the money to the table. His brows sank so that he glowered at her. "I'll tell you how. You needn't stand there like an angel looking into hell. Use your head and you'll see. We need money, don't we? What with winter coming and you wanting clothes for yourself and the kid, we need money, don't we? Sure. Have we got any of our own? No, we ain't. Stands to reason we got to get it somewhere." "But, Tim, stealing..." "Stealing is one way to get it, and I used that way. The farm didn't give us a cent this year, did it? No, nobody around here made any money this year. Nobody except the doctor, because we had rotten weather. We had sickness instead of crops. and the doctor gets his money out of our misery. Look at his wife, buying wristwatches and brooches and diamonds and fancy dresses out of the money her husband sucks from us poor sick farmers. Is it right? It ain't. I didn't take much from him. Maybe the whole business here, including the cash, ain't worth more than $500. It'll tide us over to winter. What'll it mean to him, the doctor? Nothing. He strode ponderously to the window and glared out into the night. Trickling rivulets of rain traced their crooked courses on the pane, but he did not see them. He saw nothing. In defiance, he was awaiting his wife's answer. Agatha Cruz was eyeing the fortune on the table. Queer thoughts raced through her brain. New thoughts. Fearful thoughts. If those things could be sold for $500, it would mean a comfortable winter, proper attention to Gilbert, her suffering son. She glanced at the boy. He was leaning on one elbow, his eyes feasting themselves upon the display of wealth on the table. "Put your head down on the pillow, Gil," she ordered, and he obeyed, unexpectedly laughing with a wild joy. "We're rich now, ain't we, Mom?" he cried deliriously. She offered no reply. She considered rapidly. Then her low voice called, "Tim." Slowly the man looked around. "Were you seen? Anybody know you did it?" "No," he snapped brusquely. "Think I'm a fool? Of course nobody knows, except you and the kid. And you ain't gonna tell." Then as long as nobody knows, why don't you want to call the doctor?" "Call him?" He appeared amazed. His feet astride, he remained silent for an instant. He had expected his wife to preach a sermon on the evils of theft. Instead, she was still thinking of summoning the physician for Gilbert. "Yes," she said quietly. "The boy needs him. He'll get worse, maybe, if we don't call." "But, Agatha, do you want me to tempt the fates and everything by calling the doctor right after I've robbed him? He'll be so excited over finding a safe open he won't want to come anyway. Call him."
"A doctor always comes, Tim."
But... An inexplicable cowardice was gripping him. He did not wish to face the man whose home he had robbed. He was afraid of something intangible. "Say, Agatha, use your head. It's after midnight and it's raining cats and dogs. Dr. Philemon lives 4 miles from here. Why make him come out on a night like this?"
"Gil needs him,"
she insisted, calmly obdurate. "Gil can wait till tomorrow."
"He can't. I won't let him. The boy's terribly sick. He gets a doctor tonight."
"But 4 miles."
"You don't have to walk it. Go down the road to Drake's. That's only 1 mile. They'll let you telephone."
"Oh, look at that rain," he objected.
"Tim, if you don't go, I will. You fool, don't you see the boy needs a doctor? He's as red as fire. Who knows what's wrong with him?"
Still
nothing," she ejaculated, spitting the words at him. "You're afraid to meet the doctor, that's what. But I ain't. What's to prevent our hiding the things you took from him? What's to prevent our putting them where the doctor won't see them when he comes? They don't have to be on the table all night."
The realization that his wife was not condemning his theft, that she was actually making of herself an accomplice, stirred a peculiar emotion in Timothy Cruz. It is soothing to have one's sins shared by others. He experienced a surge of courage. He moved forward hesitantly. "You don't mean, Agatha?"
"I don't mean anything except that we need the doctor. And if you ain't going right now to phone him, I'll go myself."
"And the brooch and the money and the watch, what?"
"Hide him in the closet. He'll never guess you got him here, will he? He ain't a mind reader. Besides," she paused thoughtfully.
"What?"
"Oh, even if somebody saw you there, or thought they saw you, or somebody like you, I'm just supposing, Tim, then your calling the doctor here would sort of kill suspicion, see?"
Timothy Cruz did see. A shrewd appreciation of his wife manifested itself in a comprehending smile as he nodded. "You're right, Agatha."
"Are you going to call the doctor?"
she demanded. He lifted his drenched coat from a chair. "All right," he agreed. "I'll walk down to Drake's, and you hide the things, Agatha." And from the bed of Gilbert came a hysterical wail.
"Hide him in the closet, Mom. Hide him in the closet. We're rich now, ain't we?"
The boy ended his question with a hysterical, shrill laugh. End of section 1. Section 2 of Weird Tales Double Feature: The Death Pit and In Kashla's Garden, by Oscar Schisgall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Death Pit, Chapter 2. Dr. Philemon Calls. It was after 2 o'clock in the morning when Dr. Philemon, huddled under the leaking top of his buggy, drove up to the rickety porch of the cruise house. He stepped awkwardly to the ground and muttered an oath as his feet sank into deep mud. Carefully he moved to the head of the horse. He tied the rein to one of the square beams which supported the roof of the porch. The rain splashed upon him, upon the mud-spattered animal. He felt a stream of water run down his sleeve as he fastened the rein, and he grumbled audibly. But his protest ceased when he heard the moans of Gilbert Cruz, distinct above the noise of the wind. Agatha opened the door for the doctor, and he eyed her angular being with mingled pity and contempt. These poverty-stricken farmers who lacked energy to earn a living from a source other than the soil disgruntled him. They were worse, he firmly believed, than Russian peasants. He unwound the muffler from his throat, threw off his great dripping coat. No longer was he looking at Agatha or at Timothy, standing in a dark corner. Now his attention was fixed on the flushed young face under the light of the oil lamp. Gilbert emitted an occasional moan. He tossed about incessantly, his small hands groping upward. "How long has he been like that?" asked Dr. Philemon, rubbing his palms for warmth. He was a big man, almost as big as Timothy himself, and he cast a long, ungainly shadow on the wall. "Since noon," replied Agatha monotonously. "He's been delirious. Talks about all sorts of things. Just babbles. His fever is awful." Dr. Philemon shook his head. "Trouble here, trouble at home, trouble everywhere," he chanted as he went to the bedside. "Trouble at home?" asked Agatha, casting a quick glance to the corner in which her husband stood in attentive silence. "Yes, the whole town will hear about it in the morning." "About what?" The doctor scowled into her face. His voice became hoarse. Pounding his fist on the back of a chair, he exclaimed, "I've been robbed, that's what! Robbed!" Agatha stepped back in well-simulated amazement. Her mouth hung open, her eyes were circles. Before speaking, she turned to her husband, as if to inform him of the physician's astonishing declaration. Then she gasped, "You've been robbed?" "Yes, over $500 worth of stuff, right in my home." "When?" "This very night, before I came here. Lord knows it was no easy matter to hitch up and travel through this storm, 4 miles, while my own wife is home half crazy after this night. All her valuables are gone, lost, the safe broken open. It wasn't a safe, just a rotten old box anybody could break through with a good chisel or something. I wouldn't have come if your husband hadn't told me how sick the boy was. Let's look at him." But Agatha was not satisfied. She wanted to hear the details of the doctor's story. She had committed herself to the task of aiding her husband in his struggle against the law, and it was well to know the enemy's information. "When did you find out about this robbery, Doctor?" she queried. "When? When your husband telephoned me, that's when. I went down to the office to answer the call, and there I saw the little safe, open. Everything, money and jewels, gone. Oh, I phoned everybody with authority in the village, pulled him out of bed. In the morning there'll be an investigation." From the dark corner issued Timothy's voice, resonant and deep and vibrant. "Hope they find the thief, Doctor. It'll be hard to lose that much money." "Hard? I work for it hard enough. Traveling 4 miles through a storm at 2 o'clock in the morning, and 4 miles home again, when my own wife is as nervous as...
Sorry, muttered Agatha, but the boy was very sick."
And as if to vindicate her, Gilbert began to moan. His head tossed from side to side. He did not seem to notice the doctor's presence until his wrist was firmly gripped between searching fingers. Then he looked up, squinted inquiringly.
"Who are you?"
he asked, almost threateningly. "Quiet, my boy, quiet," murmured the physician, eyeing his watch as he felt the boy's pulse. He was forced to bend toward the lamp, and he did not see the wordless messages passing between Timothy and Agatha Cruz.
"Who are you?"
repeated Gilbert. "Shh! Quiet, boy! Mrs. Cruz, can't I get better light? This flickering wick is bad for the eyes. Can't see."
"I'm sorry," apologized Agatha. "We have no other lamp."
Again Timothy's voice rumbled out of the darkness. "Maybe I could hold a match over the watch, Dr. Philemon. The light might be better." "Thanks, no." The physician was frowning. So annoying a lack of household conveniences forced one to forget professional dignity. He was chilled, bad-humored. The prospect of the 4-mile journey home through the steady rain deprived him of all cheer. He grumbled instinctively, and suddenly stopped. Astounded, he was gaping upon the sick Gilbert. The boy had raised himself on his elbow. He glared toward his father's corner, a wild, feverish light lending glittering brilliance to his small eyes. He coughed, gulped, then cried, "Pop, is this the doctor? Is this Dr. Philemon?" He did not wait for a reply. He fell back upon the pillow, laughing deliriously, and his little lips began to prattle hysterically. "Dr. Philemon, the doctor. We're rich now, ain't we, Pop? Ain't we, Mom? Oh, we're rich. You got the doctor's money, didn't you, Pop? Is it wrong to steal, Pop? Is it wrong to steal, Pop? It ain't wrong. No crops, you said. Didn't you? She bought diamonds and fancy dresses, but you got the money, didn't you, Pop? From the toy safe. Does the doctor know you took it? Tell him. Tell him. Hide the things in the closet, Mom, before the doctor comes. That's right. In the closet, on the third shelf. There they are, on the shelf in the closet. A watch and something else and money. We're rich, ain't we, Pop? Ain't we, Mom?" Gilbert subsided to an incoherent drool, chattering of money and jewels in the closet. He was squirming under the covers. But no longer did Dr. Philemon listen to the boy. He had turned. He was staring queerly into the terrified eyes of Agatha Cruz. Behind the woman stood her husband, big and menacing and glowering furiously. They were speechless. Dr. Philemon drew in his lips, peered sidewise at the closet. Then, with unexpected vigor, he sprang across the somber room, pulled open the closet door, thrust his hand over the third shelf, and... "So," he cried softly, "so you took it, Cruz." His fingers fondled the jewels. Over them his eyes gleamed in the fantastic glow of the lamp. He came very close to Timothy. His fat face was thrust forward so that his breath fell warmly upon the farmer's cheeks. "So," he whispered, "so, well, I'm going to the village, and you'll be in jail before the night's over, Cruz. I'll have you in jail, or—" Timothy's huge hands plunged forward and fastened themselves to Dr. Philemon's chest. "You ain't going to do nothing of the kind," tremulously declared the thief. "You ain't." "Oh, I ain't I?" jeered the physician. "We'll see about that. Let go of me." "You ain't," insisted Timothy. His voice had sunk to a low, harsh rasp. He curtly told his wife, "Agatha, lock the door." But Agatha did not move. She stood stupefied, unable to speak. The sudden flood of events against her husband, had overwhelmed the woman. Tall, bony, erect, she gazed at the doctor. One thought charged repeatedly through her mind. They were caught. They were caught. They were caught. Though her eyes saw, she was not certain of what occurred during the following few minutes. She had a vague vision of the doctor breaking from her husband's grasp. He lurched toward the door, but Timothy was behind him, pulling him back. The doctor's fist rose, thudded against her resounding chest, without effect. An answering blow, a scuffle, and the struggle began. 2 huge men they were, Timothy Cruz and Dr. Philemon. They battled like giants, but the physician was soft of body while the farmer was solid and muscular. Their fists flew, they collided with the table, threw it over, upset chairs. They crashed against the walls, fell, rose again, pounded each other, and on the bed, the fiery-eyed boy sat up and cheered frantically. "Hit him, Pop! Hit him! Oh, that was a good one! Give him another! In the face! Break his face! Another one, Pop! Kill him! That's the way! Oh, that was fine! Right on the mouth! Oh!" Agatha watched. There was nothing she could do. She, a woman. Nothing? Yes, there was something. On the floor she saw the brooch and the wristwatch and the money. She picked them up and dropped them into the pocket of her skirt. She had no doubt about the outcome of the fight. Her Tim would win. He always won in physical contests. The doctor was gasping, staggering unsteadily, and still his fists answered the blows of Timothy. From his mouth a stream of blood, hideous in the yellow light, trickled over his chin, and Tim Cruz hissed between breaths, "You ain't gonna tell. I ain't going to jail, I ain't." And then he did a brutal thing. He poised his fist, waited, and sent it smashing with all his strength against the jaw of the doctor. That was the final blow. Dr. Philemon ushered a choked cry. He toppled back, fell, and his head was battered against the corner of the fallen table. Very quietly he lay on the floor, while Timothy panted over him like a victorious dog, his mouth open, his chest heaving. He waited for the doctor to stir, but the doctor did not stir. Around the head on the floor a small pool of crimson was forming. little streams groping out like the tentacles of a tiny octopus, and into the red smudge dripped the physician's hair. Agatha stared at the appalling sight. Her eyes were dilated. The breath was imprisoned in her throat. For as she looked, a terrible dread swept over her. She wanted to scream, but could not. Impulsively, she darted forward, fell to the floor at the doctor's side. Her hands groped over his chest. They tried to find his heart, to feel its beating. She gazed at the ugly gash at the back of the head. She gazed, and suddenly started back with a little cry. "Tim," she gasped. "Tim, he's dead. You've killed him, murdered him." And like a fiendish echo came the voice of the sick, delirious boy. "You killed him, Pop! You murdered the doctor! You killed him!" End of section 2.
Section 3 of Weird Tales double feature, The Death Pit and In Kashla's Garden, by Oscar Schisgall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Death Pit, Chapter 3, The Well. The knowledge of the horrible thing he had done left Timothy Cruz dumbstruck. Stupidly, he stared from the motionless body to his wife. His mouth, smarting and swollen from the blows which had been stormed upon it, formed the word, "Dead." She nodded, her expression of terror as fixed as the leer of a gargoyle. She was still kneeling beside the inanimate form, but her hand had sprung away from the silent heart. Timothy glanced around uncertainly. His fists opened and closed. He was conscious of the bleakness of the chamber, of the incessant rain pattering on the window, of the weird light on his son's face. He shuddered, and his hands smoothed his ruffled hair. "Dead," he repeated, as though he were endeavoring to convince himself that such a thing was possible. "He's dead." Slowly he moved away. He found himself beside Gilbert's bed, and he sat limply upon the chair. The boy was watching him with curious intensity. Something akin to pride covered Gilbert's countenance. Very softly he said again, "You killed him, Pop. You did it." Timothy's two huge hands were clasped in his lap. He murmured, "If only you hadn't babbled, son. If only you hadn't babbled." "He ain't responsible, Tim," stammered Agatha, rising to her gaunt height. She stepped away from the body, meanwhile speaking. "He ain't meaning to do anything wrong. The boy's delirious, out of his head." No," whispered Timothy Cruz, and a strange tenderness stole into his tones. "It ain't your fault, son. It's the fever." He did an unusual thing. He leaned forward awkwardly and kissed the burning cheeks of his son. There were times, rare perhaps, when Cruz forgot his swaggering bravado. Then sentiment mastered him for an instant as it was doing now. But the spell always disappeared at once. After it, his love for Gilbert or for Agatha was displayed by gruffness. Impetuously he rose, glared at the body of Dr. Philemon. "What are we going to do with that?" he rasped. Agatha stood beside him, and strangely it was she who assumed control of the situation. She who had become calm and who was scheming. She who gave orders. Her tone admirably steady, she said, "I've just been thinking of it, Tim. They'll be around in the morning, everybody, to look for him. I suppose his wife knows he came here." Yes, what are we going to do?" A spasm of fear gripped him. His great figure shook visibly as he chattered. "They'll take me, and then I'm done for. Murder. You realize what I done, Agatha? Murder. If they get me." "They ain't gonna get you," said his wife, with imperturbable assurance. "They ain't?" The words quivered. "What can I do?" "You'll do what I say, and we'll be safe." His features shone with the inspiration of new hope. He caught her arms and whispered with terrible tenseness, "Oh, get out. Away from here. It's only a little after 2. Before they come in the morning, I can be pretty far away. Long start, then—" "Tim," she interrupted his suggestion with a sharpness that cut into him. Her lips curled back in an ugly sneer, and she pulled her arms from his grasp. "What are you saying?" she hissed. "Run away? Leave me here alone with Gil and Gil sick? Alone with that thing on the floor? What are you saying, Tim?"
He gulped helplessly, understanding the cowardice of the suggestion. Avoiding her accusing gaze, he muttered, "What else can I do? You don't want 'em to get me, do you?"
"No, I told you they ain't going to get you, if you listen to me. Are you quiet enough to listen now?"
He nodded like a schoolboy being chided.
"Nobody," she said decisively, "is going to hear about this."
"But how?"
"Listen to me, you fool. When I say nobody will know what you did, I mean it."
"How are you going to stop them from knowing? They'll see that." His shaking finger pointed at the corpse. Now the little pool of blood had grown to an appallingly large smudge, and was still growing. Timothy looked away, a dreadful revulsion sickening him. But his wife was becoming steadily calmer. She went on.
"Nobody's going to see that thing. We're going to hide it."
"Hide it?" From the bed came Gilbert's shrill repetition.
"You're going to hide the doctor, Mom." "Yes, hide him. Hide him where no one will ever find his body."
In his anxiety, Timothy was actually cringing before her. "Where?" he asked tremulously. Agatha's deep voice was lowered. Her eyes narrowed.
"In the well," she said.
"The well?"
"Yes, the dry well. You're going to fill the thing up with dirt, aren't you? It's no good anymore."
"I know, but—"
"But nothing, Tim. That's going to be the doctor's grave, that well. We'll throw him into it tonight. Now, you'll carry him out, and then we'll put the boards over it. No one will find him. After they go away, or better, after a couple of days, we'll fill it in as we were going to do. No one will be the wiser."
Had he found the courage to do such a thing, Timothy would have hugged his wife. Her plan was beyond reproach. The old well in the yard, long since dry, offered an ideal tomb, an ideal place of concealment. No one would search for the doctor's body there, especially after it would be filled. The well... "You're a good girl, Agatha," he murmured. She did not answer, but from Gilbert came a gleeful exclamation.
"The well! Hide the doctor in the well, Mom. That'll be fine."
Uneasily, Timothy glanced down at the body. "The blood, Agatha," he stammered. "They'll see it." She looked at the fearful stain. Its dark crimson was joined by the yellow of the oil lamp, forming a queer, indescribable blot of color.
"Don't you worry about the blood, Tim. You take the body out to the well. I'll wash the signs away. I'll fix up the room so no one will guess. Don't worry about the stains."
She wondered of a sudden why she was taking all these precautions on behalf of the man who had neglected her so cruelly during the entire 9 years of their married life. But she brushed aside the hesitancy. He was her husband. Gilbert was her son. For their sakes, she must fight the law. She could not afford to lose Timothy, and she could not bring disgrace upon the boy. She must fight. Peculiar, she told herself, was the fact that she could speak so boldly of blood and a corpse and burial. She no longer suffered from the horror of the situation. Instead, her mind was coolly planning a means of escape. Funny how the mind works under a strain. Timothy interrupted her musings. Again his voice trembled with misgivings, and again he stammered weakly. "But his wife, Agatha, she knows he came here. They're bound to suspect us." A contemptuous smirk twisted her full lips.
"You fool. Can they prove he came here? Arrived here, I mean. Suppose we insisted he didn't arrive."
"We can't. His horse and buggy are outside." Energetically, Timothy sprang to the window. He stared through the streaming pane into the blackness, his nose pressed against the glass. "Sure," he hissed. "There it is, tied to the porch." Agatha considered. She bent her head and frowned. That horse could not remain outside. That evidence, too, must be destroyed. All evidence must be destroyed. They must find a perfect alibi, a story that would convince the villagers. For a long time she remained motionless, gazing with listless eyes at the floor. But not at that part of the floor on which the dreadful thing lay. Timothy, quaking and baffled, stood by the window. He watched her anxiously, watched her because he knew his life depended on her decision, watched her as a criminal watches the foreman of a jury. And after many minutes, she spoke, quietly, decisively.
"Very well," she said. "We'll change our story. Tim, after you get that thing into the well. You're going to get into that buggy and drive about halfway to the doctor's house. There you can tie the horse to a tree and walk home."
"Drive halfway? Say, what's the idea?"
"Just do as I say and we'll be all right. You leave the horse halfway to the doctor's house, see? Then we'll admit that he was here, that he left about 2:30. They'll find the empty buggy and, well, let them wonder about the mystery of what happened to the man. He'll just sort of disappear, see? We won't know anything about what happened to him after he left. His buggy halfway home will show that he started away from us."
Again, Timothy Cruz experienced a surge of admiration for his wife. He had never suspected that she could behave so sensibly, so tranquilly under trying circumstances. But an inherent sulkiness and shyness stilled him. He did not express his thoughts.
"It's a good thing," Agatha continued, "that it's raining. Your tracks around the buggy and from the buggy home and around the well, they'll all be washed away."
"That's right. Never thought of that."
"You haven't thought of anything yet," she answered somewhat bitterly. "There's something else, too. Look in the buggy, if you can find some sort of doctor's kit. I guess it ought to be there. Take out a bottle of some medicine. Proof that he visited us, just to make our story true."
At this evidence of keen scheming, Timothy could no longer suppress a word of praise. He rubbed his hands, shifted his weight from one foot to another, and declared, "Agatha, you're all right."
"Thanks," she replied dryly. "Now, let's get busy. Take him out."
It was a gruesome duty, one which was repellent even to Timothy, but he stiffened himself in grim determination and bent to the corpse. And as his hands touched the still warm body, he abruptly paused, for Gilbert, almost forgotten in the excitement of planning safety, called,
"Throw him in the well, Pop! Throw him in the well!"
Sudden frenzy in his eyes, Timothy glanced up at his wife, rigid and ominous. Her hands were clasped. Her face was hard. She stood as stolid as a sphinx watching him. "Say," he whispered, "we can't tell when the kid is in delirium or when he's all right. Suppose he blabbers to the people about this, same as he blabbered to the doctor. Suppose—" Agatha scowled in concern. The weird illumination cast black shadows under her drawn brows.
"First good thing you thought of," she muttered. "We've got to be careful. Can't give the boy a chance to blabber. We...
She stopped pondering, but she had trained her mind to overcome obstacles in the path of their safety, and it was not long before she decided on a means of guarding themselves from Gilbert's delirium.
"We'll put the boy upstairs," she said curtly. "It'll be harder to hear him there, and we'll say he's got something contagious, scarlet fever. We can even put a sign on the door. You'll make a sign, Tim. Scarlet fever. We'll tell him the doctor said no one was to go into the house. That'll keep him away from Gil. We'll answer all questions outside, understand?"
Cruz actually smiled in glee. "Where do you get all these ideas?" he asked fervently.
"Not from you. Now get busy with that. I want to wash the stains."
With savage control of his emotions, Timothy applied himself to the task. Into the well in the yard he dropped the huge body of Dr. Philemon, and when he heard it thud against the rocks 50 feet underground, he felt faint and dizzy. He dropped the doctor's hat and coat and muffler into the pit, kicked its covering of boards into place, and rushed back through the rain to the house. He fell upon a chair, buried his head in his hands, and sat moaning and swaying. "It was terrible," he told Agatha. "That sound when he hit the bottom."
"Forget it. Drive that buggy away."
She was scrubbing the floor as easily as though she were merely erasing blots of mud. Her angular figure bent to the work, moving back and forth rhythmically with each scratch of the brush. And presently Timothy regained sufficient strength to begin his journey through the storm. It was miserably chilly as he drove down the road, and he hunched his shoulders while the rain splashed against his face. He passed the dark house of the Drakes, a few other homes, and finally he reached a desolate spot where he tied the horse to a tree. After that he trudged home, feeling as if he had removed an unbearable weight from his soul. The dim light in his window promised no cheer. Rather, it gleamed with malicious foreboding. It lured, as the eyes of a snake lure. He moved toward it through the penetrating rain, and his heart beat furiously. When he entered the door, he saw Agatha sitting by the bedside, her bony hand on Gilbert's forehead. She turned to Timothy in tremulous concern.
"We'd better put him upstairs," she said softly. "Soon as I got through cleaning the room, he started saying something like a song he learned in school. A crazy thing. He was delirious again. We'd better put him upstairs."
"What was he saying?" demanded Tim, throwing his wet coat on the once more upright table. In answer to his query, Gilbert stirred. He squirmed his mouth open, and hysterically he began chanting a horrible parody of a song he had been taught. His eyes glared at the yellow lamp, and he sang,
"The doctor's in the well, the doctor's in the well. I own the cherry-o, the doctor's in the well."
End of The Death Pit, Chapter 3. Weird Tales Double Feature: The Death Pit and In Kashla's Garden by Oscar Schisgall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Death Pit, Chapter 4. The Inquiry. Though they carried the boy to the upper floor where they tucked him comfortably on a cot, there was no sleep for Agatha and Timothy Cruz that night. Sleep after the terrors of the past few hours was impossible. Everything was impossible, save their sitting in the dark room, silent and morbid. Agatha sat near the window, her stolid face bent, her hands clasped in her lap. Opposite her, Timothy glared at the lamp, his huge countenance deeply lined. Nervously, his hands rubbed over his knees. He was not conscious of his wet clothes. He was conscious of only one thing. He had murdered a man. And in the morning he would be compelled to meet inquiring villagers. Well, his story was ready. Their unspoken meditations were interrupted a dozen times by the chattering of Gilbert. From the upper floor floated the weird chant of, "The doctor's in the well." It fell upon Timothy Cruz with the weight of a blow, and shattered his courage. Each wildly uttered word pounded upon his conscience, pounded steadily, gloomily, unavoidably. He writhed under the weight of the song. Once he sprang to his feet, stamped across the room, and rasped madly, "Can't you make him stop? Can't you make him stop that damn thing? He's driving me crazy." Moodily, the gaunt Agatha answered without glancing up,
"Sit down, Tim. It's the boy's fever. Don't let it bother you."
He tried bravely to follow her instructions. When he sat again, his hands gripped the edge of the chair in an effort to find strength. But he could not escape the fantastic, repeated,
"The doctor's in the well."
At dawn, when Agatha blew the flame from the wick of the oil lamp, he was limp and haggard. With bent shoulders, he sagged in his chair, and his lips quivered. Soon the villagers would come, and upstairs Gilbert was still muttering occasionally,
"The doctor's in the well."
A bright sun vanquished the rain clouds. Fresh from its shower, the countryside sparkled in the golden light of morning. Vapory masses of billowing white rose lazily from the mountain forests and were wafted away in ephemeral cloudlets. The vague odor of pine drifted down upon the rickety home of the Cruzes. Timothy stepped out of the house, filled his lungs with the invigorating air. He looked for an instant at the brilliance of the rising sun, blazing above a distant ridge. He stared about, as he did every morning, at the maze of fiery colors and the dying leaves of autumn. And then he glanced at the boards which covered the well. He shuddered. 50 feet under those boards lay the lifeless thing he had thrown there. With gratification, he noticed that no marks of his footsteps remained in the mud. The rain had effectively washed them into oblivion. Queer, he thought, how daylight brought reassurance and courage. He could breathe easily now, though his head throbbed with lack of sleep, and his eyes were black and cadaverous. He turned to find Agatha, angular and forbidding and ungainly beside him. She thrust a slip of paper into his hand. "Nail it up to the door," she said sullenly. "Don't stand around dreaming. When the folks come, tell 'em you put this up until the doctor sent you one of those regular signs. Get busy, Tim." He fixed the paper to the door. It bore the alarming words, "Scarlet fever." "That'll keep 'em out," mumbled Agatha. She was right. It was almost noon after an interminably long morning, when 4 men from the village walked up the road to their home. When the delegation, rather breathless from the rapid search for the doctor, came into the yard, they paused. The glaring sign stopped them as abruptly as the muzzle of a gun might have done. They eyed each other hesitantly, but Agatha and Timothy stepped out of the door, a tall, menacing couple, uncouth and lumbering. It was the woman who called, "Good morning." A short, bald man twisted his hat in his hands, moved forward to act as spokesman. Before venturing a word, he tugged at both ends of a shaggy mustache. "Morning, Mrs. Cruz. Is your Gilbert who's down with the fever?"
"Yes, the boy."
"The boy's in a terrible condition," interposed Timothy. That, he recalled, was the proper phrase for such an occasion. Somewhat abashed, the spokesman stammered, I'm sorry we got to bother you, then, but, well, something mighty peculiar's happened. Something very strange." "What's that?" demanded Timothy. He frowned questioningly.
"Dr. Philemon, he's disappeared."
"Dr. Philemon?" Even Agatha admired the surprise in her husband's tone. She raised her brows to indicate her own amazement.
Yeah," grumbled the spokesman. "Just disappeared."
Timothy eyed his wife, then turned back to the villagers. "What do you mean he's disappeared? When? How?"
"Dunno, Cruz. Dunno anything about it except what we found this morning."
"What?"
"His wife, she sent out a sort of general alarm. Said her husband hadn't come home after going to your house." "He did come to our house," said Agatha. "I know, so we started up here to ask if he'd left, and we found his buggy down the road."
"His buggy?" exclaimed Timothy, moving forward out of the door. "You found his buggy?"
"Yeah, empty."
"Well..." Timothy addressed the exclamation to his wife, and Agatha succeeded in looking mystified, though she was racked by turbulent nervousness. From her position, she could see the boards which covered the well. The sight nauseated the woman, but she was too hardened as stoic to surrender to her emotions.
"What do you mean, you found his buggy empty?"
she demanded. The bald spokesman shrugged.
"Just that, Mrs. Cruz. We came upon it about a mile or so down past Drake's. The horse tied to a tree, and no sign of the doctor."
Agatha expressed fright in her widened eyes.
Do you think he could have been held up?"
"Held up?
On a night like that, in that storm and everything? Dunno, ma'am, but it don't seem likely. Besides, well, lots of queer things happened last night. The doctor's house was robbed."
"What?" It was Timothy who again vented feigned surprise.
"Yeah, his wife's jewels taken, money taken, safe busted. And then the doctor comes up here and disappears. Funny."
"Mighty funny," agreed Cruz. He scowled and scratched his head. "Let's see," he mused. "He left here about... What time would you say, Agatha?"
"About 2:30, I guess."
"Yes, about then. Got into the buggy and drove off." The bald man pulled at his mustache, perplexed.
"Didn't he act sort of strange?"
"Not as I noticed," decided Timothy.
"He didn't say a word about the robbery?"
"You know, he
discovered it before he left home to come here."
Cruz felt an impulse to utter an oath. He cast an uneasy glance at his motionless wife, for he realized they had erred. Surely Dr. Philemon would have mentioned the robbery. It must have been paramount in the physician's mind. To suppose that he would have called without speaking of it was ridiculous, and yet the Cruzes had simulated amazement at the announcement of the theft. Their caution had been too great to be convincing. He could detect a hint of suspicion in the villager's query. The man had turned to look at his three associates. A meaning look, it seemed. But Agatha Cruz assumed control of the situation as she did in all crises. She was cool. Her gaze had roved over the distant hills to the blue skies, to the drifting clouds skimming lightly before a flippant breeze. As she watched them, a pained expression crossed her features. She said quite pathetically,
"Maybe the doctor did act sort of funny. Maybe he did, Tim. We didn't notice. Our Gil was so sick. So sick. Even the doctor must have forgotten that robbery when he saw the boy. He didn't mention it anyway. He was too busy with Gil, poor boy."
The spokesman coughed sympathetically.
"Of course," he said. "Of course Dr. Philemon wouldn't have bothered you with his own troubles at a time like that. He was too much of a gentleman, was the doctor. I mean,
Is the doctor. He hastily corrected himself, as if regretting the implication in his use of tenses. What seems to be the matter with your boy, Mrs. Cruz? She choked a sob, a sincere sob this time, the sob of a mother. Fever. He's got the fever. Pityingly, the spokesman shook his head. That's awful, he muttered, and one of his associates mumbled. Come on, guess we better be getting back, men. We ought to tell Mrs. Philemon about the buggy and get some police on the job. Come on, let's go. Mrs. Cruz has a boy inside. Readily the spokesman acquiesced. He rubbed a hand over his great mustache and said, Well, guess we ought to at that. So you ain't got any information to give us, Cruz? None except what I told you. Doctor left here about 2:30 after seeing our Gil. Said he'd send a Board of Health sign up to put on her door. We put this one up meanwhile to keep folks out. No use letting the thing spread. No, of course not. Well, thanks, Cruz. Don't know what we're going to do about all this. We have to leave it to the police, I suppose. Well, goodbye. Hope your boy gets better real soon. Thanks, replied Timothy, watching the villagers turn away. Great elation was bubbling within him. He had evaded suspicion. He had fooled them with his wife's brains. And when the visitors had vanished down the road, he turned to Agatha. His eyes shone. He gripped her arms. We did it, he whispered gleefully. We sent them off. Yes. Moodily she nodded, as impassionate as ever. Come in. We left Gil alone. They entered, and the boy's voice came to them in its monotonous chant, thudding upon their nerves with its pitiless persistence. The doctor's in the well, the doctor's in the well. Timothy suddenly shuddered. He eyed his wife uneasily. Can't we make him stop that noise? He exclaimed harshly. His answer came from the upper floor. Gilbert cried, I want to see the whale. Take me to the well. Let me see the whale. The doctor's in the whale. End of The Death Pit, Chapter 4. Section 5 of Weird Tales Double Feature, The Death Pit and In Kashla's Garden, by Oscar Schisgall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ben Tucker. The Death Pit, Chapter 5. The Piper is Paid. Gilbert's illness became worse during the day, so alarmingly worse that Agatha did not leave his bedside, though her eyes were heavy with lack of sleep. Though she could have slumped down to the floor in sheer weariness, the gaunt woman maintained her vigil. Every few moments her bony hand caressed the boy's fevered forehead, and at such times his ravings abated. Timothy's endurance was not so great. In the afternoon he threw himself upon a bed on the lower floor, and fell into a deep sleep. He dozed off during one of the intervals in which Gilbert was quiet, and there on the bed he sprawled and emitted loud rhythmic snores. Agatha listened, and somehow she sensed an intangible injustice in the situation. Why was she, who had extricated her husband from a dreadful danger, sitting awake, suffering at the bedside of her son while Timothy slept? That had ever been her husband's way. During moments of danger he was nervous, almost cowardly, relying entirely on his wife's ingenuity. When the danger had passed, he forgot it, left her with the after-effects while he slept. Yes, there was injustice in his attitude. She grumbled. Her mouth hardened grimly. If it weren't for Gilbert, she would not have tolerated Timothy's ways. For Agatha Cruz, though somber and unattractive and unsentimental, still retained one feminine virtue. She loved her son with all the passionate ardor a woman can bestow upon an only child. If ever she possessed a tender instinct, it was vented in motherly affection. She would have sacrificed everything for Gilbert. He was the one thing which made her colorless life worth living. For him she did everything, gave everything. And even if she did not realize it, her husband shared those emotions. He felt no particular love for his wife, but for his son, the only offering he had ever made to the world, he nursed a strange, unexpressed masculine adoration. It was seldom shown, seldom permitted to evince itself in actions, but under his brusqueness the love for his child slumbered ever. It was deep, passionate. Were anything to happen to Gilbert, Were the boy to die of his fever, life would have become worthless, empty. And so these parents, merely tolerating each other, were held in family ties by their son. They were wondering what his fever would do to him, wondering in unexpressed fear. And yet Timothy could sleep, a strange, unfathomable man. He was roused when darkness had once more fallen over the countryside. He blinked up into the sallow, bony face of Agatha. She had lighted the oil lamp, and its sickly yellow light played upon her features. She shook his shoulder. "Wake up, Tim, and get something to eat. Gil's fallen asleep." With much grumbling, Timothy rose. They ate meagerly at the rickety table, the flickering lamp between them. As he peered at her weirdly illumined countenance, at the black shadows under the cheekbones and under the eyes, he said, "You look tired, Agatha." It was an unusual attention on his part, even to notice her weariness. Quickly she glanced down at her plate. "Been sitting with Gil," she explained. "How is he? Seems quiet now." "Yes, just fell into a doze, but he's worse than yesterday. Much worse." "I wonder." His words were interrupted with stunning suddenness. Agatha jumped from her chair. He too rose, gaped at the wall. From the upper floor had come the piercing scream, and Gilbert's voice shrieked wildly,
"The doctor's in the well! I see him, Pop, I see him! He's in the bottom of the well! I can see him, Pop, I can see him again!"
"Delirious again,"
whispered Agatha. Timothy rushed up the stairs, his wife behind him. They found the boy writhing in agony on his cot. His face was crimson, blistered. The lips, parched and sore, squirmed as he prattled insanely of the doctor in the well. Timothy caught his son's hands, gripped them tightly as if the pressure would ease the suffering of the child. Beside him, Agatha looked on, stern and worried, breathing hard.
"He's worse than ever," she murmured. "Worse than ever. I'm afraid, Tim."
"He'll be all right after a while," he assured her, though he felt no confidence in his assertion.
"All day he's been saying he wants to see the well."
Timothy shuddered perceptibly, but he answered, "He'll be all right. He'll be all right."
"But I'm afraid, Tim."
They remained at the bedside while Gilbert's delirium became steadily more turbulent. Gazing anxiously upon the stricken boy, Agatha forgot her fatigue. Forgot that she had not slept in 2 days, that she had not eaten. Even that murder had been committed in the lurking shadows of her home. She thought of Gilbert only, of the danger in which her son was. And after an hour she seized her husband's arm and declared,
"Tim, we've got to get another doctor. Get Dr. Lute from Hurleyville. That's nearest. We've got to."
At the suggestion, Tim changed. His features had been lined with commiseration for the sick child. Now, as he turned in amazement to his wife, pity gave way to terror. His mouth opened wide. "Get another doctor?" he gasped. "We can't."
"And why can't we?"
Because, don't you see, Agatha? The other doctor will hear Gil blabber about the well and...
"Blabber about the well,"
she murmured, dazed. And then she understood. For Timothy's safety, no one must enter their home before Gilbert recovered from his delirium. And for Gilbert's safety, a doctor must be called. A predicament which brought into conflict her maternal instincts and her desire to shield her husband. She paled as she stared at the boy. If she didn't summon a physician, who could say what might happen? If she did... A slight shudder coursed through her gaunt body. Appealingly, she looked at Timothy. This was a time when Agatha Cruz needed sympathy, needed a strong arm and a strong mind to guide her, needed them desperately. She was tired and shaken by the events which had fallen upon her. Within her something was drooping hopelessly. The burdens she bore were fast becoming too heavy. She needed support. Instead, she received from her husband a look of misery, of cowardice, of fear. She found herself forced to decide without help, and she did.
"Tim," she said softly as she rose, "I'm going to phone Dr. Lute."
Without another word, she descended the stairs, creaking under her weight. In the dark chamber on the lower floor, she threw a shawl about her shoulders in preparation for the walk to Drake's. It was an old shawl, gray and lifeless, conforming with her personality. Though she eyed the food on the table rather wistfully, she determined to telephone for the physician of the neighboring town before she did anything else. The fantastic glow from the oil lamp fell upon her worn features. She blinked at the light, for her eyes smarted, but she had reached a decision and she moved to carry it out. Timothy must be sacrificed for Gilbert. Mother love was the most powerful. But even as she strode forward grimly, Timothy clattered down the steps. He rushed to the door, placed his broad back against it. As he faced her, he appeared gigantic, towering, even menacing. The sickly light poured upon his distorted, puffed face. "You ain't going," he snarled. Pausing, she eyed him coolly. "I am." "I say you ain't, and you ain't." Her lips parted in an ugly sneer, hideous on her sallow features. "You're a coward, Tim. You ain't a man, you're a dog." "Don't care what you say," he rasped back. "I ain't gonna hang 'cause you think the kid needs a doctor. He don't." He'll die if I don't get one." Timothy gulped, glanced away in fear, but immediately his bravado reasserted itself. "He won't die, that's just your talk. You're going to stay right here. No doctor, nobody comes into this house till the kid stops blabbering about the well." Agatha's lean arms were crooked as she placed her hands on her hips in a challenging gesture. "Suppose I do go," she said. "I ain't going to let you." "What'll you do?" "Keep you here, that's what." "By force? With your hands?" "Yes, with my hands." She smiled bitterly. "It won't be the first time you beat me," she said. But slowly she turned and went back to the bed. Upon it she sank thoughtfully. There was no sense in opposing Timothy when so violent a mood was upon him. She knew her husband. He would beat her, throw her upon the floor, compel her with brutal force to remain at home if she attempted to call a doctor. She did not mind the pain his fists inflicted. What troubled her was the knowledge that a beating from her husband would incapacitate her for days. It had always had that effect, and there would be no one to care for Gilbert. No, she could not throw her strength against the power of Timothy. She would wait at least until he slept. The fact that in a short time Gilbert subsided into deep slumber lent Timothy cause for malicious gloating. "See," he told her as she gazed wanly upon the boy. "He's better now, ain't he? Sound asleep, quiet. Suppose you called a doctor, it would have been a useless risk. Who was wiser, you or me?" "You, of course," she replied sardonically. "Sure, I was right, and now the kid's asleep. Suppose we take the opportunity to rest. Come on, Agatha, let's go down. You need sleep, if you're half as tired as I am." "Half as tired as you?" she repeated weakly and smiled. Oh, how unutterably stupid and cowardly and vile she was discovering her husband to be. Without undressing, they threw themselves on the bed. The lower floor, with the light blown out, was impenetrably black. It took Timothy but a moment to fall into sonorous sleep. But Agatha lingered on the border of wakefulness. She would wait a while, she promised herself, until Timothy would no longer notice her movements. Then she would steal off to telephone Dr. Loop. Gilbert needed him. Needed him. She dozed off, slept for a long, long time. Unconsciously, she snuggled against the warmth of her husband's huge body, and her arm crept about him. Two lumbering farm toilers, suited to each other, yet unhappy. It must have been near dawn when she awoke with a start. She was trembling as she sat up in bed, and her hand rose to her lips. She looked about the blackness, saw nothing. Yet, strangely, she sensed a premonition that something was wrong. Beside her, Timothy still slept. She thought of the doctor, and she cursed herself. Why had she permitted weariness to conquer her? She must go now, now! Quietly, she pushed herself off the bed, groped for the shawl, threw it around her ungainly back. She started for the door and saw with a gasp that it was open. A breeze, blowing in upon her, scattered her straggling hair and brought a queer dread. Without a sound, she turned, hurried up the steps to Gilbert's room. A moment later, she flew down, flung herself desperately upon her husband, shook him to wakefulness. She was screaming.
Tim, Gil is gone. He's gone.
He blinked up through the darkness. Huh? What?
Get up. Gil is gone, I tell you. He's gone. He's not in his bed, and the door's open.
She was quivering as if the fever had caught her. She actually dragged Timothy out of the bed by sheer force. And as the meaning of his wife's words sank into his consciousness, he suddenly displayed an access of energy. He hissed a fearful oath, dashed up the stairs. Instantly he returned, dazed, staggering. "You're right," he said. "He's gone."
And the door's open.
"God," he whispered. Then he sprang to the door and with all the power of his lungs shouted, "Gil! Gil! Son, where are you?" There was no answer. As he called again, his voice throbbed with the anguish of his soul, anguish which Agatha shared, felt even more keenly. They tore out into the night, rushing about desperately in a wild search. And as she ran blindly, Agatha Cruz yelled hysterically.
"It's your fault, Tim. Your fault. You wouldn't let me go for the doctor. That might have saved the boy. You wouldn't let me go. I tell you, I swear. Do you hear? I swear if anything happens to him, I'll tell everybody everything about the murder. Everything."
Timothy was suffering and torture too great to permit his saying anything but, "If anything happens to him, I don't care what you tell everybody." And then suddenly he came to an abrupt stop, while all of the strength oozed from his quaking body. His legs sagged, his eyes were dilated. He crumpled to his knees, gaping before him at the ground. Agatha came to his side. With a moan of horrible comprehension, she fell beside him and gazed in terror-stricken fascination at the ground. A finger, trembling, moved forward to point at the dreadful thing. Before them yawned the open hole of the well. The boards had been pushed back.
He wanted to see the well,"
whispered Agatha, each word forced out of a choking throat. Without a sound, the quivering Timothy bent forward. He lit a match, cupped it in his hands, and held it over the pit. Mother and father peered down, peered in fearful awe. And then Agatha Cruz collapsed against her husband's shoulder. Far, far down in the well, scarcely visible in the dim light of the match flame, lay the still body of little Gilbert, sprawling across the form of Dr. Philemon. End of the Death Pit. Section 6 of Weird Tales Double Feature, The Death Pit and In Kashla's Garden by Oscar Schisgall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ben Tucker. In Kashla's Garden, Chapter 1. In amazement that verged on downright consternation, old Mr. Curry, the attorney, sank back in his chair and gaped at the agitated man opposite him. You mean to say," he demanded incredulously, "that your wife exerts a power as strong as that over you?" "As strong as that? It's stronger! Oh, 1,000 times stronger than you can possibly imagine!" Trembling with the despair that filled him, Roger Byrd almost sobbed the words. His fists were fiercely clenched on the lawyer's desk, one of them continuously pounding as if to release compressed energy. Deep in his haggard eyes lurked the flames of unutterable anguish. He looked in truth as though he were battling to crush down explosive hysteria. Uneasily, Mr. Curry swallowed and wet his lips. He grumbled something indistinguishable. Then, scowling, he muttered, I never heard of anything so uncanny." At that, Byrd leaned forward, while those brilliant eyes of his burned into the attorney's. "You never heard of hypnotism?" he challenged, and his tones raced up the scale to a shrill, defiant pitch. "Well, yes, of course, but not to such an astonishing extent. I thought... Why, really, Byrd, this is quite beyond me." Profoundly bewildered, Mr. Curry brushed an unsteady hand up over his moist forehead and allowed it to sweep back across his pompadour of silken, unflecked whiteness. Staring at the man who had come to him with so extraordinary a problem, he encountered only an expression of impotent wretchedness. He scratched his chin, nervously tapped the edge of the desk. "Suppose," he suggested, "you tell me how you became the victim, That is how you were subjected to such an influence. I confess I'm totally confounded. If you want advice, you will have to explain more clearly."
Roger Byrd rose, not as another man might rise for a recital, but with a sudden spring that caused his chair to fly back tottering. His right fist delivered a final blow upon the desk. Then, glowering at the floor, he began striding about the lawyer's study. He was still a young man, just venturing into his 30s, yet the lines which had of late been carved in his dark skin added at least a decade to his appearance. A quivering tenseness had beset his tall figure, so that under his gray suit every muscle seemed vibrant as he paced the room. He was troubled, moreover, by the disheveled condition of his black hair. Time after time he was constrained to throw it back with an impatient jerk of his head, a gesture that merely emphasized the strain upon him. "It started 2 years ago, in Calcutta," he began.
"Where you met your wife," murmured Mr. Curry, nodding.
"Yes. You know I was making a trip through India."
"You had gone there, I remember," interrupted the lawyer somewhat coldly, "to escape the scandal of that affair with the Royler woman."
Byrd whirled around to glare across the desk. A flood of scarlet rushed into the cheeks that had been pallid. He raised one hand impetuously, but let it fall again after an instant of silence. "Mr. Curry," he said, a strange harshness creeping into his tones, "I'll ask you to forget my past troubles at this moment. I have enough to worry me without being reminded of other things."
"I beg your pardon,"
said the attorney, but his shrug belied the earnestness of his apologetic inflection. Byrd frowned. He looked down at the carpet as though to recall the narrative he had momentarily abandoned, and then, resuming his nervous pacing, he continued without glancing at the lawyer. "In Calcutta I met a friend, an American, who told me about the wonderful powers of Kashla. Mystic powers, he called them. She had a booth in the marketplace where she entertained tourists by demonstrating her hypnotic ability, for a price, of course. I went to her. I went with that air of superior cynicism all travelers affect, ready to scoff at her trickery. I thought I should find an old hag, dirty and fawning. Well, my first surprise came when I saw Kashla. She was young and in a way beautiful. We chatted pleasantly, we laughed. You know how two people can be. Naturally, I still disbelieved in her mystic power, and so she offered to prove to me what she could do." Byrd paused. His fingers moved across his lips, shaking. For an instant he shut his eyes, although whether it was to conjure up or blot out some awful memory, the lawyer could not guess. But the silence passed, and Roger Byrd proceeded, rather unsteadily and in staccato syllables. "She made me sustain the gaze of her eyes. Black eyes, Mr. Curry. Terrible eyes. They blazed. They stung. They made me sway dizzily. I don't know what happened. All I know is that I regained consciousness 2 hours later, and I was lying on my bed in my hotel." The two men regarded each other across the desk, one gaping blankly, the other peering with savage intensity. Mr. Curry once more smoothed his white hair. Again he wet his lips. When he spoke, it was in a queerly hushed way. "You mean you were in a trance all that time?" "Yes. I walked home in a trance. She controlled me from her booth, controlled me implicitly. Of course, I rushed back to her. I was filled with wonder and astonishment, but Kashla only laughed at my excitement. And do you know what she said?" Mechanically, Mr. Curry shook his head, his eyes wide, marveling. "I remember her words distinctly. I shall always remember them," whispered Roger Byrd. He had come to lean over the desk. Now his flushed features hovered directly over Mr. Curry's round face. He dropped word after word as though each were a stunning blow. "She said this: 'I have subjugated your mind and your will. Henceforth, if I desire it, you are mine.'" The attorney uttered an exclamation that dwindled into a grunt. "But that was nonsense," he protested. "Oh, was it?" cried Byrd, sneering. "Well, listen. I thought so too. I ridiculed her. She told me that a mind once conquered remained hers, and offered to prove this new contention.
She assured me that at 7 o'clock the following evening, regardless of what other plans I had made, I should be in her booth. It chanced that I had an engagement to dine with friends at that hour. I was not at all afraid of Kashla. In fact, I almost forgot her the next evening. And at 6:30 I arrived at the home of my dinner host. I distinctly recall hearing a servant announce the meal. I even recall starting toward the dining room while I chatted with an eminent Hindu. Then a puzzled expression leaped into Bird's eyes. Then something happened. My mind suddenly went blank. What I did, or how, I cannot say, but when my senses returned to me, it was precisely 7. And there I stood, in Kashla's booth, blinking down at her while she laughed. Stirred, visibly affected, Mr. Curry reached for a cigar. He lit a match, thoughtfully held it until its flame scorched his fingertips, and cast it away without having puffed once. Keenly squinting up at Kashla's victim, he asked, "And she has never lost this power over you?" "Never," declared Bird. "When she learned I was rich, that I had a fortune in America, she decided to marry me. She decided, you understand. I tried to run away from her. Indeed, I went as far as Bombay, when one day, while purchasing a steamship ticket, I suddenly lost consciousness. The next thing of which I was aware was being back in Calcutta, beside the laughing Kashla." Evidently the recital was plucking as severely upon Mr. Curry's nerves as upon his credulity. He rose, a thick-set, stocky man with a loose double chin. Again he indulged in his habitual gesture of brushing back his white pompadour. Looking at Bird sternly, he demanded, "Are you trying to tell me that you traveled from Bombay to Calcutta in a trance?" Roger Bird emitted a short laugh, a bitter, wrathful laugh. "You don't believe it," he snarled sardonically. "All right, let me go on. I did go to her in a trance. In that condition, I moved as rationally, as safely as though I were myself. The only difference is that I am controlled by her will, her mind, instead of by my own." "But despite that, you married her." "What else could I do? She willed me to marry her." "Eh? She willed?" "Certainly," snapped Bird, relaunching his quick paces and communing now with the floor rather than with the staring lawyer. "She compelled me to marry her, made me want to do it. Do you think that under normal circumstances I, Roger Bird, who could marry any one of a dozen rich American girls, would have selected an Indian mystic from a Calcutta marketplace? Pah! Think, Mr. Curry, think!" Throughout Bird's agitated talk, the attorney had been striving to compose himself, that he might consider this extraordinary situation sensibly, unemotionally. Now, eyeing his client, he saw matters more clearly. Roger Bird had always been an impulsive creature of a sensitive and high-strung nature. That a hypnotist could dominate him was not so strange after all, for his own will had been lamentably weak. Since childhood, it had been merely a weather vane pointing the direction of other people's desires. Yet Bird was ostensibly suffering, and the old attorney could not help scowling in concern. "I understand," he said slowly, "that you wish me to find a way of obtaining a divorce for you, or an annulment, if possible." "Yes, I'm sick of being mastered. She made me install her here in my home, and half my servants quit, so she imported servants from India. She redecorated many of the rooms so that I live in an Oriental museum rather than a house. I'm tired of it, I tell you. Whatever she wishes, I am forced to do. Anything at all. If I don't do it voluntarily, I do it under the spell of her will. I tell you, Mr. Curry, if I can't get rid of that woman, I may as well kill myself." "Oh, now," soothingly mumbled the lawyer, though he was frowning down at his desk in a manner far from reassuring. "I wouldn't talk like that, Bird." "Because you haven't lived as I have for the past 2 years. An absolute mental slave. Why, I can't even run away. She makes me come back. Distance is no barrier." Of a sudden, Roger Bird sank into a chair. He bent far forward, sent his fingers writhing through his disheveled black hair, and in utter wretchedness he moaned, "I'd rather be dead than go on like this. without a will of my own. For a long time, absolute stillness gripped the room. Mr. Curry moved to a window where, his hands clasped behind his back, he stood gazing out over a Westchester panorama of rolling fields sprinkled with colorful rooftops, the whole scene drenched in golden morning sunshine. Beneath his window, his blue automobile waited to hasten him to his New York office. Looking to the left, he could discern the white residence of Roger Byrd, an imposing house visible through a screen of poplars aligned in military precision. It was less than a quarter of a mile away, a fact which had facilitated this early call. But Mr. Curry was not pondering upon the things he saw. Instead, his thoughts were focused on the character of his despairing client. The friendship he manifested toward Byrd was based upon an ancient family intimacy, rather than on any personal esteem or respect. For Roger Byrd was scarcely the type to inspire admiration. In the past 10 years, he had been involved in half a dozen deplorable escapades with women, affairs that had cost him amazing sums. The last of them had sent him scurrying off to India, that he might escape the presence of an irate lady named Edwina Royler. That his flight had resulted in this tragic situation was perhaps unfortunate, yet it was possessed of a certain poetic justice which Mr. Curry was compelled to appreciate. Suddenly his reverie was shattered by Byrd's exclamation, "Well, what's to be done?" The lawyer turned, fingering his heavy watch chain. Quietly he answered, I don't know. This case is new in my experience, I must confess. I should like time to think, to consider." "Then in heaven's name," cried Byrd, jumping up, "think fast. I've been suffering 2 years, and they've seemed to me 2 centuries. End of In Kashla's Garden, Chapter 1. Section 7 of Weird Tales Double Feature, The Death Pit, and In Kashla's Garden, by Oscar Schisgall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ben Tucker. In Kashla's Garden, Chapter 2. When, at a few minutes before 10, Roger Byrd returned to his home, he found his wife seated in her garden and smiling pleasantly at his approach. It was a magnificent spot, this garden Kashla had caused to be planted in accordance with her oriental taste. Fronting the white-pillared house of the Byrds, it was thronged with all manner of exquisite flowers, so that the senses not only reeled with the sweetness of its perfume, but marveled at the splendor of 1,000 brilliant hues. An artificial brook crawled here and there, crossed at points by small arched bridges that were canopied with vines. It had indeed become a showplace, and automobilists frequently stopped to stare at the glories Kashla had contrived to bring into her garden. Butterflies fluttered about incessantly, intoxicating themselves on the exotic wines the flowers yielded. In the surrounding trees, birds of vivid plumage sang and chirped and pecked as though they had agreed to select this point of beauty for their own domain. Kashla sat in a wicker chair under a bower of rambling red roses, a neglected book lying open in the grass beside her. She was attired completely in flimsy white, and even Byrd could not deny her entrancing loveliness. For Kashla was beautiful. Beautiful in the maddening way only women of the East can achieve. Her hair, which was as lustrously black as the plumes of the crows that sometimes circled over her garden, was drawn down tightly over her ears and coiled in an immense bun on the back of her neck, so that she resembled, in her white dress, some ancient Grecian goddess. She never availed herself of cosmetics, and her smooth skin, though tinted to an olive complexion, was always pale. But it was a queer pallor, an unhealthy, unnatural pallor. Often it made Byrd think of death. In truth, Kashla was not a healthy woman. Frail, supple, small in stature, her mental strength had been developed at a lamentable sacrifice of her physical hardihood. So it was that she never indulged in anything which required exertion, her most taxing exercise being occasional walks about the garden, and she moved there with the ease and the languor of a phantom. Like other frail women, she was addicted to tonics and medicines, many of which were compounded on Oriental prescriptions. But these in no manner affected her mental strength, and she governed her husband with all the energy of her fierce fantastic power. When he entered the garden, she summoned him with a slow wave of her white hand. Bird went to her, frowning. "You have been out on your morning walk?" she inquired amiably. Her voice, though throaty, contained all the flexible music of a clarinet. He nodded. "And today?" she pressed on. "You have not forgotten, Roger, what you must do today?" In the past 2 years she had learned to speak English with astounding proficiency, though she still retained a melodious accent that evoked delight from everyone save Bird himself. He glared down at his toe. "Today," he said stiffly. "You want me to buy you the new town car."
"Ah, you remember. And you will leave soon?"
"Immediately." He had not wished to purchase the new car that Kashla desired, yet he comprehended the folly of protesting. If he did not comply with her request willingly, he knew he would obey in a different way, and voluntary acquiescence was invariably preferable to being subjected to her weird influence.
"Then go now, Roger,"
said Kashla, smiling at him and gesturing toward the house. Her flaming black eyes laughed up at him, as though mocking his helplessness. He bit his lip, bit until he felt a sharp pain. Then he muttered something and went into his house, preparatory to the unavoidable trip to the city. So eager had he been to interview Mr. Curry at his home that he had not paused to shave. And now Roger Bird, passing through a corridor that reeked of oriental incense and mounting a staircase whose wall was tapestried with the figures of snakes and dragons, entered the bathroom. As thoughtfully, resentfully, he loosened his collar and drew off his shirt, he stared through the open window. The rattle of a lawnmower rose through the warm stillness of the summer morning. Bird looked down. There was Ozul, the Indian gardener Kashla had brought to tend her flowers. A bent, swarthy little man who seemed engrossed in no other worldly interest save his botanical duties. He was pushing the lawnmower to and fro, to and fro. Ozul the silent, the queer, the man who appeared sometimes to see and know everything, and who seldom spoke of anything but flowers. "What a crowd she's drawn me into," actually rasped Bird as he turned for his shaving brush. Before him, just above the washbowl, was a marble shelf loaded with Kashla's medicines and tonics. He sneered at it. He hated those bottles as he hated everything symbolic of his wife. One of the bottles was almost empty. It contained a brown fluid in which Kashla had been accustomed to place absolute faith. What it was, Bird did not know. Some queer concoction brought out of India. One she took twice a day, at 9 in the morning and at 4 in the afternoon. Peculiar stuff, he told himself while shaving. There was but a mouthful left in that bottle, only a single dose. Had she the prescription for another supply? But of course, Kashla had all her prescriptions. Her life depended on them. She had once confided to him. What could be so potent in this tonic? He had never seen any of it in this country. It looked like iodine. Yes. Iodine, iodine, iodine. Of a sudden, Roger Bird stopped shaving. He stood rigid, his wide eyes gaping at his lathered reflection in the mirror. It looked like iodine. It has been said that men conceive 1,000 vagrant fancies while shaving. How this particular idea ever struck Roger Bird he could not explain. It simply came to him, as if it were an inspiration. A horrible thought it was. It stiffened every muscle in his tall body. Iodine. He began to think, frantically, desperately, wildly. He considered the idea from every possible angle. What if Mr. Curry could somehow have the marriage annulled? What if he could secure a divorce on some grounds? Would that terminate Kashla's power? No. She had promised to be the mistress of Bird's mind forever, and forever meant until death. Until death. Death was the only thing that could sever the bond that linked his subjugated mind to her hypnotic power. Death. Rivulets of perspiration oozed out of his forehead to stream down into the lather. Death. The tonic looked like iodine. There was iodine in the medicine chest. Death. Iodine. Round and round in a furious cycle, the thoughts whirled in his brain. People would say she had taken iodine by mistake. Others had died by drinking from the wrong bottle. It was nothing novel. And so easy now. He could pour out that tonic and substitute an equal amount of iodine. Kashla would gulp it down in one swallow as usual, and then the end of mental tyranny, the end of slavery, of torture, freedom. Oh, great God, what an idea! The lather was still on his face, but Roger Byrd had forgotten it. He was breathing rapidly, heavily, as he worked over those bottles. Whatever horror he may have experienced was overwhelmed by the mad exultation he derived from a vision of freedom. This was the only way, the only certainty by which his mental shackles could be destroyed. And he leaped at it eagerly, unthinkingly. When the tonic had been spilled into the washbowl, he allowed water from the faucet to gush out forcefully, that it might wash away all stains. Then he carefully, oh so carefully, poured iodine into the medicine bottle. It was done. Roger Byrd stood quaking, yet oddly ecstatic. His eyes blazed. Perspiration coursed freely down his entire body. While he was in New York purchasing a new town car, the thing would happen. Consequences? He did not care about them or worry as to what might be his eventual explanation. Anything was better than a continuance of this fearful life. The coroner would declare she had taken poison by mistake. What else could he say? Oh, but yes, there was a danger. It occurred to Roger Byrd quite abruptly and left him frowning in bewilderment. Would not any investigator know that iodine had been poured into that tonic bottle? Would not any detective demand to know who had poured it and why? For several minutes, Byrd contemplated this hitherto neglected peril. In his agitation, he had viewed only the ultimate escape from Kashla's power. Now other things occurred to him. But his mind was functioning with furious rapidity. In a moment he had developed a scheme which brought a shrewd smile to his lathered face. He broke off the neck of the iodine bottle against the edge of the marble shelf. Spilling the rest of its contents into the washbowl, he threw the remnants of the bottle into a metallic basket in a corner. And now he had assured himself of a plausible alibi, one which would prevent anyone's accusing him of willful or premeditated murder. For he could say to an inquirer, "Yes, I poured the iodine into that medicine bottle. Why? Well, when I reached for my razor, I inadvertently upset it. The bottle fell and broke at the neck, but a little iodine remained in its bottom. I saw that empty medicine bottle and poured it into that." Empty? Of course, the medicine bottle was empty. And who could oppose him in that contention with Kashla dead? Who indeed would doubt him? Roger Byrd actually grinned with the prospect of freedom from his wife's power. Oh, he might be held for homicide, but with a clever, influential attorney like Mr. Curry, with so plausible an explanation of his unintentional act, with his family name, with the aura of an accidental catastrophe hovering over the whole business. "Freedom," muttered Roger Byrd. And then, suddenly glancing through the window, he saw Oziul the gardener. Oziul was still pushing the clattering lawnmower, steeped in his task with bovine complacence. Yet Oziul might have been looking up through that open window. Nonsense, Byrd assured himself. He's been busy. He doesn't even know I'm here. There's nothing for me to worry about. Why, by tonight I'll be free. Free from her. And he shaved joyfully, confident that his apprehensions concerning Oziul were unfounded and insignificant. End of In Kashla's Garden, Chapter 2. Section 8 of Weird Tales Double Feature, The Death Pit and In Kashla's Garden by Oscar Schisgall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. In Kashla's Garden, Chapter 3. Jubilant in an unholy, demoniacal way, Roger Byrd motored into New York in his own yellow roadster. On the journey he gloated. What splendid dreams were approaching realization! The death of tyranny! He decided to follow his preconceived plans in passing the day, lest any deviation from his normal habits be construed as worthy of suspicion. Accordingly, he lunched at one of his clubs and tarried in a merry conversation with one of the other members. Over cigars and jolly anecdotes he sat until 2:30, and he laughed often and heartily, though his merriment occasionally sounded queerly shrill, strained. Then he occupied himself in the selection of a town car, a task that consumed most of the afternoon. It was 6 o'clock when he finally started homeward, and a flat tire delayed him another half hour. Finally, however, at almost 8 o'clock, Roger Byrd drove within sight of his imposing white residence. As he neared it, his heart thundered, his whole being shook. How would he be greeted? By news of Kashla's death, of course. The servants would chatter in confusion, informing him that they had tried to telephone his clubs, but all attempts at locating him had been futile. Oh, he could visualize the calamitous scene, and it filled him with palpitant delight. Twilight had settled on the country, a grayish-purplish twilight, strangely hazy. In the western skies flamed a few streaks of orange and yellow. Their glow permeated the vagueness of oncoming night. Byrd drove on, already conscious of the heavy perfumes emanating from Kashla's wondrous garden. He turned the car into the driveway, while every beat of his heart seemed a violent explosion. He was, he knew, on the very brink of freedom. More than that, by this time, he was free. Toward the garage he directed the roadster. Perhaps 20 feet he rode into the grounds. And then, with an impulsive motion, he jammed on his brakes. The car stopped with a jerk that sent him lurching forward. Very still he sat, gasping, aghast, dumbfounded. He was staring toward that bower canopied with rambling red roses, where Kashla had been seated in the morning. And as he stared, his forehead became dripping wet, and every trace of color ebbed from his cheeks. A sense of abject hopelessness, more insufferable than pain, swept through him. It was the crash of dreams, the bursting of the bubbles he had blown. For there, under the roses, smiling at him sweetly, sat the white-clad Kashla. In the hazy light he saw her hand languidly rise to beckon him, and he went to her, dazedly. "Have you bought the town car?" she asked when he stood before her. Mutely he nodded, his eyes round and stupefied. "That is good," murmured Kashla, her fingers straying to wind about the stem of a dangling rose. "I see, my dear, dear husband, that you are surprised, no, shocked, because you find me still alive, eh?" The taunt in her low tones tortured him. The perfume of the flowers made his senses ache with their load of sweetness. He was perspiring copiously now, and his hand unsteadily brushed across his moist forehead. "What do you mean?" he demanded defiantly, his voice hoarse. "Oh, why should we play innocent with each other, Roger?" Not once did her smile vanish. Over her fragile figure the purple twilight settled, like a mantle of unreality. She shrugged. "Ozul saw through the bathroom window." "Ozul saw?" gasped Byrd, terrified. "Of course. He saw you toying with the bottles. So I was wise, my dear, and I did not take my tonic today. Ozul is very loyal to me, you know." In his devastating chagrin, Roger Byrd could have shrieked. Instead of freedom, he had encountered failure. But somehow he managed to restrain his wild impulses and stood motionless. Kashla, the slender, ethereal Kashla, lavished her smile upon him. "I cannot altogether blame you, my good husband," she said, every word mocking him in that subtle, melodious way. "I have been very severe with you, but when one tries to murder, one must suffer some punishment." Trembling, Byrd attempted to exonerate himself by blurting, "It was an accident. I broke the bottle." "It was no accident," calmly answered Kashla. "And you will be punished. I shall tell you how, Roger. Mr. Curry, your lawyer, is waiting for you in the house." "Mr. Curry?" he repeated mechanically. "Yes. Oh, he has already told me you wish to be rid of me." Mentally, Byrd cursed. What an idiot the attorney was for babbling things. With all her mellifluous placidity, the slim Kashla went on. "I do not want to send you to prison. What use is a husband in prison? But I want your friend Mr. Curry to know what you have tried to do today. After that, I think he will not be so anxious to help you." Byrd recoiled, stricken by fear. His eyes were round and ablaze. "I can't tell him," he cried. "Oh, yes, you can, and you shall. Do not be afraid. He will not send you to prison. He thinks too much of your family. But I want him to know what you did."
I can't tell him, groaned Bird. You shall. I can't. And then he encountered Kashla's suddenly narrowed eyes, twin specks of fire that burned their way into his very brain. He felt a dizziness surge over him. He swayed. He knew his will was under her dominion, and now she was exerting her fantastic power, sending him to confess to the lawyer. Roger Bird went. He could not help going. He was completely governed by Kashla's will. His very thoughts were dictated by her desire. Like a creature in a dream he walked, entranced and impotent, and Kashla remained under the roses in her favored bower, looking after him. In the orientally adorned drawing room, Bird found Mr. Curry and 2 other men. Who these were he did not know, nor did he dare speak in their presence. Yet words somehow gushed to his tongue, words he could not suppress, words sent there by Kashla. He turned to Mr. Curry. It occurred to him that the attorney sat strangely pale and grave. Bird bowed. In low tones that poured from him in a monody, he said, Mr. Curry, today I tried to murder my wife. I substituted poison, iodine, for her tonic. And as soon as he had uttered those words, Roger Bird sensed a change well through him. The power that had been clutching his mind released its hold. He remained suddenly his own master, thinking clearly. But he quivered as he gaped at Mr. Curry, and he opened his mouth to a circle of astonishment. For Mr. Curry, as well as the 2 other men, had sprung toward him. Now the lawyer was grasping his arm, shaking it violently. And in a choking voice he cried, You did that, Bird. Momentarily, Bird was frightened by the tremulous vehemence. Then, while a wan, helpless smile twisted his lips, he mumbled, Ozil the gardener would have told you anyway. She'd make him. But the gardener swore he knew nothing, ejaculated Mr. Curry. The confident assertion caused Bird to frown. Had Kashla lied to him? He sucked in a sharp breath. What did Mr. Curry mean? My wife, he replied stiffly, told me he knew everything. Mr. Curry stepped backwards and looked blankly at the other 2 men. Then he peered more intently at Bird. Your wife said that? He demanded. When did she tell you that? Why, just a moment ago in the garden. Mr. Curry gulped, wet his lips. Slowly his 2 hands were lifted to grasp and shake Roger Bird's shoulders. Are you crazy? The lawyer whispered. Your wife drank poison and died at 4:30 this afternoon. End of In Kashla's Garden. End of Weird Tales double feature, The Death Pit and In Kashla's Garden, by Oscar Schisgall.